It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the weekly podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch every Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Now, let's jump right into the time stream again with the Doctor in this pretty well-regarded classic Doctor Who serial from 1975, Genesis of the Daleks. And I think we should start by getting a lay of the land of the whole Doctor Who series in 1974 and 1975. On June the 8th of 1974, Jon Pertwee left the role, having regenerated after having his body ravaged by the effects of the blue crystals of Metebelis 3 in the 6-part serial Planet of the Spiders, which featured, yes, giant spiders. Personally, as an arachnophobe, it's pretty surprising how much I like that serial. Now, it's been debated exactly how long my favorite Doctor, Jon Pertwee, was going to last in the role. Some feel that he would have still left at the end of that 11th season regardless, but with it being an epic final confrontation with his friend Roger Delgado's The Master character. We talked a little bit about him back when we last did The Demons. However, Delgado's death prevented that final confrontation, and that led to other reports said that it was actually Delgado's death that more or less forced Pertwee out of the role, as he was so deeply saddened by the loss of his friend that he decided to leave the series altogether. It's hard to say what's actually truth, but Pertwee at the time had been the longest running Doctor, having spent nearly half the time the series had been on TV portraying the titular character. When he left, the BBC decided to call in two-time Golden Globe nominated actor from Nicholas and Alexandra, Tom Baker. Now, Baker was a little bit down on his luck after appearing in the epic drama as Rasputin. He really wasn't getting the roles he expected after such a meaty role. In fact, despite being an impressive actor, Baker was actually relegated to working on construction sites at the time the BBC and showrunner Barry Letts came calling. They liked him a lot and felt that he was the right guy to take over for Pertwee, and Baker would end up doing two major feats in the role as the fourth Doctor. The first is that he starred in more episodes and for more years as the Doctor than anyone else, and became a pop culture icon, becoming the literal face of the entire Doctor Who series. To this day, anyone who exclusively watches the present-day modern Doctor Who would still know who Tom Baker was, and could tell you from memory what he wore in the role as the Doctor, most notably an 18-foot scarf that the character said was knitted for him by Madame Nostradamus. Now, Baker loved playing the Doctor. While the man would often visit pubs in the towns that location filming was done in and would lead raucous parties with castmates and locals, he also took a considerable amount of care about how he was viewed by the public, particularly by children. If he was dressed as the Doctor, and especially if kids were around, he would never be seen drinking or smoking. He never wanted to damage a child's perception of the heroic character. He took that extremely seriously. There could be hours of discussion of how Baker held the role, how he had a ton of creative control, who he befriended, made enemies with, but that's not really what we're doing here today. I will say that by the time Baker left the role on the 21st of March 1981, he left shoes that were mighty big to be filled, and I'm not sure that anyone has been all that successful since. What we are here to talk about are the menacing pepper pots that are the Daleks. Now, the Daleks were created by Terry Nation, who was smart enough to retain the rights to the characters, which led him to nearly separating the villains from Doctor Who altogether in the 60s. The Daleks appeared in the second Doctor Who serial ever, the appropriately titled, or the title that we eventually gave that serial, The Daleks. Now, I say that because in the original first I think 2 or 3 seasons, each individual part of a serial was titled something else. So colloquially, we call that second serial the Daleks. And so all of those early First Doctor stories have a colloquial name like that, while having the individual parts of the serial individually named differently. Anyway, that's just a little bit of a side note there about those early stories. But in that episode, or in that serial, the First Doctor, Ian, Barbara, and Susan arrived on the radiation-heavy planet of Skaro that was embroiled in a horrible civil war between the Daleks, the cybernetic beings bent on destruction, and the Thals. Now, shortly after their massive success as a Monster of the Week for the Doctor, they appeared again as they invaded Earth in the 22nd century in the Dalek invasion of Earth. Both of those 2 stories were eventually turned into big screen adventures, starring Peter Cushing as the Doctor and produced by Amicus Productions. The Daleks continued to menace the First Doctor, and Nation attempted to spin the monsters off into their own media empire, which meant that Nation would almost license the creatures to the BBC. And so that also meant that between 1966 and 1972, the Daleks would only appear in 3 serials until Nation returned to write a brand new story in 1973 called Planet of the Daleks. Now, Pertwee would end up having 4 stories that featured the Daleks, the most since William Hartnell's era. Tom Baker's era only had 2 Dalek stories, and they were now being mostly reserved for big, important stories, and to the exception of a single Dalek appearing in the 20th anniversary special, The 5 Doctors, from 1982 until the end of the series in 1989, Daleks only appeared once in each of the 3 final Doctors eras. Now, Genesis of the Daleks is a very special serial. It is often considered among the best of the entire 59-year history of the Doctor Who franchise in terms of stories and themes that it examines. And what's even more surprising is that Doctor Who often runs into the kind of having a recency problem where more recent stories are considered better than some of the classic ones and therefore gets voted upon as favorites. However, Genesis of the Daleks has typically always ended up at least in the top 5 of best stories ever told. For a long time, it was considered the very best, but some polls have it as, maybe 3rd or 4th best or something like that. But it has really kind of outlasted between that and The Caves of Adrazzani, which is the 5th Doctor's final story. Those 2 classic stories have really kind of outlasted and really outdone a lot of the more recent stories that you would think people would typically vote for just because of recency. But interestingly enough, Genesis of the Daleks nearly didn't quite happen. Barry Letts and the script writer Terrence Dicks thought the time was right to bring Nation back in for a Dalek story. And when he had just done one in the previous 2 seasons, but there's always room for Daleks. He submitted a script, but Letts and Dicks felt it was a little too familiar and a little bit too much like previous stories. So they wanted something a little bit more special for the next Doctor that was coming in, and they suggested an origin story. And Nation submitted the script for The Daleks, Genesis of Terror, which would later become Genesis of the Daleks. As Letts and Dicks were on their way out, the script was handed over to new producer Philip Hinchcliffe and the new script editor Robert Holmes, who decided to tinker with it just a tiny bit. There were a few changes to the script that Nation didn't quite approve of, like some of the added violence at the very top of the first episode, but the serial would live on as one of the series' best ever. And it is true that this is also the very first example in a long history of Doctor Who that would be deemed outright revisionism. This was a different origin than what was explained in the original The Daleks serial. In the original, it was the Dals who were irradiated and transformed into the Daleks. Here, it is the Khalids that would be turned into the Daleks. And this was during a time in which people likely hadn't seen both the Daleks and Genesis of the Daleks, so changing the continuity wasn't all that much of a taboo thing to do, at least in that time. Doctor Who, just from the nature of it being a long running show about time travel, has always played fast and loose with its own continuity and established rules. Now, one thing I should point out is that Terry Nation had always created the Daleks to be analogs to the Nazis. Nation grew up during World War II and obviously had a pretty mean hatred for the Nazis, as most people should. But the Daleks were authoritarian and deemed themselves to be more advanced and superior to other races and beings, and that all definitely lines up. However, this is thrown into overdrive for Genesis of the Daleks. There are so many visual and story cues to show that this really does see the Khalids and later the Daleks to be a fascist society built on destruction and outright elimination of the Thals while they carried out their catastrophic civil war. We will get to it later on, but definitely has one of the most asked questions of all time when exploring philosophical morality. So quickly to catch up where we are in this 12th season of Doctor Who, the third Doctor had returned to Earth after defeating a supersized spider known as the Great One and being in pretty bad shape from radiation poisoning. He returns to his unit laboratory where he reveals to companion Sarah Jane Smith, often considered the greatest of all Doctor Who's companions, that pretty much every cell in his body was destroyed by the blue crystals the Great One was collecting to spread her mental powers to all corners of the cosmos. He regenerates right in front of Sarah Jane and the Brigadier into the fourth Doctor. The new Doctor, along with Sarah Jane and new companion Unit Dr. Harry Sullivan, defeats a giant robot that before deciding that he really does not want to stick around with Unit like his previous incarnation did and heads off. He first goes to the Ark in space 10,000 years in the future to help defeat an insectoid race of baddies from killing the cryogenically stored humans. Then they beam down to Earth where they plan to fix a transmat receiver terminal where the colonists on the Ark can return to the planet and repopulate it, only to run afoul of a Sontaran doing an assessment survey to report on whether or not Earth can be invaded by the militaristic race of beings. When they think they are going to be returning to the Ark, they are intercepted, and that's where Genesis of the Daleks begins. And this is more or less an interlude that interrupts a three-part set of serials all dealing with the space station Nerva and the attempts to save humanity and repopulate an uninhabited Earth. So, the story opens with a mysterious man in black having summoned the Doctor, Sarah Jane, and Harry to the desolate world of Skaro. Once learning that this man is a Time Lord, the Doctor decides he's done enough for his people. The man says that in exchange for the Doctor's freedom from Gallifrey, they ask him to do some things sometimes for them. And the Doctor thinks he's done more than enough to pay off his debt until he hears the man mention Daleks. You see, the Time Lords have envisioned a time in which the Daleks have become the predominant species in the universe after destroying pretty much everything else. And they want the Doctor to stunt their creation or possibly completely eliminate them to kind of take them off the map as a threat that they will become. When he's done, he'll use this little time ring item that the Time Lord provides to return him and his companions to the TARDIS. Now, on Skaro, they are not only in the middle of a minefield, but also find bodies of soldiers who are wearing a mix of things that don't really go together all that well. For example, they wear both a radiation detector and a gas mask, two things that are not usually worn together. Their uniforms are partly animal pelts and partly futuristic synthetic material. It's a peculiar set of situations and findings. And the Doctor realizes that maybe this war has been going on for a very long time. The people of this planet started out with the most advanced weapons and resources, but can no longer keep up and are making do with what they have and can forage from essentially the dead. Soon, the Doctor and Harry are taken inside a bunker by soldiers wearing black, and these are the Khalids. They've left Sarah Jane outside, believing her to be dead from the latest Thal gas grenade attack. They are about to be interrogated by a very young Khalid general, and the Doctor's belief that this war has carried on for several generations is only backed up by how young the Khalid leaders are. Also, he realizes that Khalid is an anagram of a very recognizable word. They are able to get free from this general, but are chased by kind of a Grand Inquisitor type of SS officer. However, when they do finally get outside in their escape, they are recaptured by Khalid soldiers and brought back to that Inquisitor, Niter. Now, Niter is cozy with a man named Davros. Now, Davros is a complicated man. He's well loved by the people like Niter, but a drain on resources to the guys like young General Ravan. Now, Davros is working on secret experiments for an ultimate war machine, and Sarah Jane is the first to see what that war machine is, a Dalek. I mean, no surprise, I suppose, they are in the title. Now, Sarah Jane is captured by a band of mutos, and mutos are a sick and malformed group of people from radiation poisoning from both the Thals and the Khalids. They are basically the discarded members of both societies, unable to be useful in war. Now, Sarah Jane and Muto Severin are taken by the Thals to work as slave laborers at the Thal Dome that basically serves as their base of operations. And at the Khalid base, the Doctor and Harry are handed over to a scientist named Ronson. Now, Ronson is a bit surprised that the Doctor's biological makeup is unlike anything on Skaro, and he seems to be opening his mind to the concept that Davros is wrong about there being no other form of life in the universe. And speaking of Davros, he comes into this lab that they're being interrogated in. And Davros is a horribly disfigured cybernetic creature who has created the, quote, Mark III travel machine, unquote. In other words, a Dalek. Currently, the Dalek is primitive and does not seem to think on its own. It has more recently been able to respond to voice commands. After arming it with a laser weapon, Davros frees the Dalek to think on its own, and the Dalek sees the nonconformity that is the Doctor and Harry and immediately wants to exterminate them. Now, Ronson is able to shut the Dalek off and begs Davros for more opportunity to interrogate the two interlopers. And Ronson is one of a few in the regime that finds Davros to be committing horrible and unethical experiments. And the Daleks were made from Khalids who became mutos and then essentially injected them with more chemicals until they became horrible tentacle-like creatures that can be encased in these Mark III travel machines. It's pretty ghastly stuff. Now, speaking of ultimate weapons, the Thals have kind of taken up so many slave laborers because they are creating a missile that the Khalids, that they plan to use against the Khalids, but it is loaded with radiation, so it pretty much kills workers quickly. Sarah Jane and the other mutos and captives at the Thal Dome devise an escape plan, but it ultimately fails. The Doctor and Harry are helped in their escape by Ronson as they plan to meet with the Khalid government and General Ravan and notify them about the Daleks. And he gives them the future history of how the Daleks are devoid of pity and will basically destroy everything. However, spies working for Davros and Niter report the meeting, and I should also say that Davros has now 2 Daleks that are fully operational. Davros deals with Ronson for his betrayal as well as the leaders of the Khalid government, and General Ravan provides the Doctor and Harry a map to the Thal Dome to break Sarah Jane out. And Davros reveals to Niter that he plans to turn the entirety of the Khalid race into Daleks, which seems to kind of give Niter some concern or at least something to chew over. Now, when the Doctor and Harry arrive at the Thal Dome, they find Davros and Niter there, not just to tell the Thal leaders that their great missile will fail, but to give them the chemical formula to break up the Khalid Dome and allow their missile to work. This is all part of the plan for Davros to essentially destroy the Khalid people and to be able to be free to mutate them further into Daleks. The Doctor and Harry free Sarah Jane and the other workers. And the Doctor attempts to disable the missile, but the Thals capture him and launch the missile anyway. And the two big problems with this. First, this destroys the Khalids, which means Davros can now create an army of Daleks. And second, the Doctor believes that Sarah Jane and Harry had escaped to the Khalid Dome to wait for him. So he believes that they might be dead. Now, Davros, now ostensibly the leader of the Khalid government, introduces a new chemical to the Dalek embryos, one that will remove pretty much all their consciousness and their and be able to make them devoid of pity and make them unfeeling killing machines. And he sends his already created Daleks to the Thal Dome to begin wiping out the Thal people. Niter finally seems to come to the realization that Davros has become a megalomaniac and will wipe out the Khalid race if it meant the Daleks could be successful. And he tells this to another scientist. In fact, it's the one who installed the new sequence to remove the consciences of the Daleks. However, it's all a ruse. Niter wanted to know who were the last opponents to Davros. And unfortunately, this happens to be right in the same part of the Khalid city where the Doctor and his recently found companions returned to finish the job of destroying the Daleks and obtain the item to return them to the TARDIS. Now, they are captured, and Davros interrogates the Doctor using Harry and Sarah Jane as collateral so that the Doctor can tell of all the times that he faced and defeated the Daleks in order for Davros to install fail-safes to the Daleks' makeup to basically make them superior. And the Doctor tells Davros that it's really the minds of the Daleks that are defective. They aren't perfect creatures that Davros thinks them to be. He then asks Davros if he could create a virus that would kill every living thing. Would he do it? Would he unleash it? And Davros thinks about it and basically says yes. Davros is just as twisted and defective as his own creations. And the Doctor learns that the button that controls Davros' life support is right there on his chair. So he threatens to shut him off unless the Daleks are destroyed. And he nearly gets Davros to order the destruction of the creatures, but Niter is able to knock the Doctor out. The scientists who oppose Davros are starting to win people over to their side and beginning to round up those who are loyal to the maniac, and they've helped the Doctor and crew escape. And Davros orders Niter to surrender to the rebels, but he plans for it to be basically a setup to either win over the people who are against him or to wipe them out. Meanwhile, the Doctor has landed on his final option as given to him by the Time Lords, and that is to essentially commit genocide against the Daleks. The Doctor sets up explosives in the Dalek incubation room to destroy the protoform flesh and blood version of the creatures, and once the other Daleks already created and rolling out about Skaro, basically wiping out the various resistance cells out there to Davros, are destroyed themselves, the threat of the Daleks is essentially over. However, the Doctor pauses. If he blows up the Daleks, is he any better than they are? There is good in the universe that the Daleks existed in. Whole swaths of planets and systems will join forces to stand up to the Daleks. He's trapped between the good that will come from these alliances and the peace that will be born from races across the cosmos never hearing the word Dalek. And he's saved from the decision by one of the resistance leaders saying that Davros has essentially surrendered and asks for a vote among the Khalid elite to determine the future of his Daleks. Now, Davros is able to put the weight of the decision back onto the Khalid race by stating that the Daleks are already a sentient race with their own minds and choices that they've made now. If the Khalids wanted to destroy the Daleks, all they have to do is press a self-destruct button and ultimately destroy their own race's future. and they are unable or unwilling to press the button. So the Khalids begin to compromise, but they still come out victorious in the vote. They have the majority to shut Davros down. Davros filibusters the decision long enough for the Daleks to arrive and wipe out the opposition to their creator. And the Doctor decides that he has to go back and destroy the incubation room, but is interrupted by a Dalek. Luckily, the Dalek itself rolls over the two wires for the charges and destroys the incubator by itself becoming the conductor for the explosive charges. Now, back with Davros and his Daleks, he discovers that the Daleks have started full production of more of their kind against the wishes of Davros. And Davros realizes now, albeit too late, that his Daleks have grown past the need of its own creator. In fact, they don't believe that a lesser being like Davros could create a superior race like the Daleks. So they wipe out Davros and his followers and promise to evolve and grow stronger and better so that one day they will rule the universe. The Doctor and gang activate their time ring to return to the TARDIS, and Sarah Jane laments that the Doctor's mission failed, but he actually disagrees because through their evil, good will also spread to combat them. All right, so let me summarize the three things that I like about this very notable and top-notch Doctor Who serial, Genesis of the Daleks. First up, I love that this is a Dalek story that does not make the Daleks the lead character or really even the lead villain. The story is pretty rich and complex, but for 12 years, Doctor Who viewers had seen the absolute terror caused by the Daleks. Now we get to see their origin, an origin that has remained pretty much intact since this serial was first shown, and the Daleks are first a remote-controlled robot before eventually becoming sentient and let off the leash. However, yes, they come creeping around corners and they're basically performing a genocide of both the Thals and the Khalids, but the war between the two factions are actually the villain here. As downright evil as Davros is, he's really just a piece of that war. He's the singular antagonist, sure, but there are no safe places for the Doctor and crew on Skaro. It's basically just a deadly place that is first home of a terrible civil war, and second, the home of the worst, most terrible creatures in the universe. So while earlier serials made the Thals a little bit more of a friendly race, and some here are, this war has corrupted them too in this story. So ultimately, we see how far war has twisted these people to where someone like Davros will rise up on the Khalid side, and the Thals take advantage of an opportunity similar to dropping a nuke on a country by accepting the chemical that will break down the Khalid dome and achieve what they think will be total victory. Now, second, Davros is one of the most significant creations in the entire history of Doctor Who. Now, we can certainly argue that he would later be way overused because he would be seen in every subsequent Dalek story from this serial to the end of the classic era. That said, Michael Wisher, who had appeared in several third and fourth Doctor adventures, but would only appear once as Davros, and perfectly played this person completely twisted and broken by evil. As I said, Davros is maybe the singular antagonist, even if the true villain is this centuries-long civil war. He's so manipulative and single-minded on his desires to create these Daleks. The scene in which the Doctor asks him whether or not he would release a deadly virus that would kill every single living thing, his reasoning on how that would give him ultimate power is chilling. He would even risk his own death to possess the power to destroy everything. Chilling is the only word I can think of to describe that. Then, as for his manipulation, he totally rules Niter, who is only seemingly infatuated with Davros because of the power he wields. If Niter stays close to him, then he will have safety, but there's something way more manipulative than that. He knows the uprising among the Khalid elite does not have what it takes to keep their race from being utterly wiped out. So he accepts their terms to submit to their demands of destroying the Daleks, knowing that they will let him try to plead his case because, as they put it, they want democracy. So they have to let him speak and try to win over some votes for his ends. He speaks about their inevitable mutation into the Daleks and that their only hope for survival is, would be the metal casings the Daleks roll around in. So he's manipulative and conniving. He knows that if he presents it as a case of living for today versus living for all time as a race, the Khalids will ultimately relent. It's brilliant. Yes, most of the time Davros is yelling and spouting some pretty crazy shit, but he's also got quiet moments that show a lot more of his deviousness and his more intelligent evil side. Now, thirdly, I mentioned earlier that this is a very rich and kind of complex Doctor Who story. While sure, the Khalids are meant to be analogous to the Nazis, yes, some of that is pretty on the nose. However, there are some more subtle things, like how the Thal's taking advantage of a missile that will basically destroy the opposition to provide total victory, like a nuke dropping to force capitulation. This is one of the earlier examples of the whole philosophical question of, if you could go back and kill baby Hitler, would you do it? Most people would think that you would have to do it. You'd like to think that, I don't know, somebody like Captain America would go back through time and eliminate that threat before it could even rise to power and plunge the world into war where millions of people will die. However, if you do that, there's a bunch that would not rise to the challenge of that great evil. There would be stunted technological advances and so forth. So that's what the Doctor has to think about while he's staring at those two wires that would set up the charges and destroy the Dalek race before they even had a chance to take off as a civilization. He is right. If the Daleks never existed, then all those alliances that bring all those planets and other civilizations together to fight against the universe's greatest evil couldn't exist. If Daleks don't exist, what advances do individual civilizations create that they can't now because they don't have a reason to make tech advances to protect themselves? Yes, the Daleks are horrible and terribly evil and very destructive. The Doctor, though, sees the good that comes to rise up to face that evil. This is one of the reasons why Doctor Who was one of my favorite heroes growing up. He doesn't need muscle or might or lead an army. He uses his principles and his brain to think about the proper path through a problem. Genocide can't ever be a decision taken lightly. Because of that, he technically fails his mission while still making a noble decision that would still lead to the death of billions across the universe. This is a nuanced decision that on the surface feels wrong, but kind of carries a ton of hope, knowing that there will be good born out of the evil of the Daleks. Now that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as on YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next week, it's time for a new TV series to dive into, but it's a TV series that is a sequel to one of the greatest science fiction films ever made, War of the Worlds. We'll take a look at episode number 1, The Resurrection, that sets the tone for a fairly dark series that left a massive impression on me when it premiered in syndication in the fall of 1988. Until next week, stay spooky.